Okay, we're live.
Hello, hello.
We actually got here. Oh, so Steph, maybe I'll start by just saying that I reached out to people that I thought had like aligned values and ways of being, and said I'd love to have a chat about you, your work, and your thoughts about inclusion and inclusive leadership. And you were on it, which
I was
before. And you also had some great examples. So it might be helpful. I might introduce myself quickly, and then if you do as well, just so that anyone listening from either channel knows. So my name is Sheila Walsh, and I specialize in inclusive leadership. And I'm publishing the book Inclusive Leadership, Navigating Organizational Complexity, May 13th. So that's why I've been like pursuing people for conversations. Now, Steph, give your background, because it'll always sound better coming from you.
So my name is Stephanie Brady, and I set up a little business called Steph B during COVID because I needed something else to do apart from dealing with HR in the middle of COVID. And it took off for me, even though it was like a little side business, and it really kind of went well with my HR role. And then in December, I decided to go for it and do it full time. So here I am, setting up hopefully a full-time business and getting the opportunity now to talk to people about things I love, because I used to have to say no a lot because I had a full-time job. So it's great to be here with you, Sheila. And congratulations.
So tell us a little bit about what you do in your small business, just so that I get a, like, yes. Whenever anyone says small, I'm always like, what do you do in your business? What is the thing you get to do now?
So the stuff I love doing most is coaching. I love coaching, all types of coaching. I'm finding it hard to niche down with coaching because I just love all the coaching. But I suppose most of it is career and executive coaching, really. So I do that. But then I'm very nerdy about certain areas of HR. And I think I bring a lot to certain areas. So I'm working on that side of my business too. So consulting, really. So things like high performing teams, things like learning and development, strategic stuff, but also delivery. I like it all. I like all the L&D stuff. High performing HR teams I'm really fascinated by. So that kind of thing. But I'm working on that right now. I'm working on exactly what my offering is right now.
I love that because I think sometimes when we start, like, and especially when they talk about niching, sometimes you have to explore your area, because you might think you're good at something, but when you're working with clients, you find out actually you're great at something else. Yes. And sometimes you have to kind of emerge with it instead of have it all solved up front.
Yeah. And that's what I'm taking time to do. And that's why this conversation is great, because I'm learning by having chats with people, some of them live like this, some of them behind closed doors, what it is that really excites me. And that's where I'm like, okay, that could be it, you know?
Oh, I love that. So when I reached out to you and we were talking about kind of inclusion, you kind of had said that you had kind of, you put in inverted commas famous. So obviously you had some experience of being known for kind of doing that. Tell us a little bit about that so I get a sense of what your experience is in that way.
For me, inclusion started with belonging. So belonging is hugely important for me, probably because I didn't feel like I belonged for a lot of my life. And then when you find it, you're like, oh, this is gorgeous. And then I thought, well, how can I do that for everybody else? And I don't know is the answer. So I ask a lot of questions. I suppose the coach in me, I'm very comfortable asking questions once they're respectful. I'm very comfortable asking, what do you need? And if people don't know what they need, I'm very comfortable at asking the right questions so that maybe they can understand what they need. Because if you don't know what you need, I don't know how to give it to you, right? So I think I'm good at that. And I'm also willing to throw myself in and make mistakes, which I know not a lot of people are. So, like, you know, I'm a bit old now, Sheila. I'm 50. So there's some words I use that my very woke 30-year-old sister's like, no, you can't say that anymore. And I'm like, okay, tell me, because I don't know. But I'm okay with making the mistakes. And I'm not going to beat myself up and try to be uberly politically correct, because, you know, I come from a time, 70s and 80s. It's different now. But I'm really wide open to figuring out what people now need from me. So I guess that's how I kind of got into it. And then I was very lucky that I'm kind of welcomed by groups, you know. I thought this was gorgeous. I was in a company, but we had a much bigger mother company. And for Pride, I think it was 2 years ago, a brand new group kind of came together. We ended up calling ourselves Rainbow Sky, but they asked me to be the straight ally on this panel that so many people around the company watched. These lovely, lovely gay men, it was only men, unfortunately, telling their stories. and everybody really connected with it. It was one of the most special things I've ever been involved in. I didn't say much. I was kind of sitting there in my pride dress, giving a couple of little comments. They'd liked my story about advocating for marriage in Ireland. They liked that, and that's why they invited me on. But it started something much bigger, that conversation, and we started seeing what people needed from us. And so then I got lucky to be invited to various groups to be that advocate, I guess.
Yeah, that's really cool, because I'm thinking there's a couple of things you said. One is about the way that what requires inclusion is evolving and changing, and also belonging. I like your frame on it, because often people think that inclusion is something we do for or to someone, but it's something you do with someone, because otherwise you're just guessing what they need, which means you're stereotyping, which means, you know what I mean? You're not actually including them, you're just doing something to them. But there's something in that kind of piece about belonging where actually the willingness to learn is what is inclusive. It's not knowing everything, because that's also, changing. And also the kind of compassion you're bringing to it. So even the way you're saying, like, I can't help the words I learned, but I can, when I know better, I can do something better. I think that that's really the kind of essence that can get missed sometimes in these conversations, because I don't know if you see this as well, but like one of the main things I talk about is the difference between societal ideas of justice and inclusion and organizational. And I talk about the fact that actually everyone has a right to be included in society because they exist. Whereas in organizations, we join organizations to contribute to the task. So we actually only belong and exist within the organization to help it thrive. Like, that's why we come together. So it can be very challenging for people to have all sorts of different worldviews and life experiences, and not to leave room for thinking about what's the practicalities in our workplace and how we're going to handle that, instead of just everyone is going to know or should know. So I really like that kind of compassion that you're bringing in, to be like, we are where we are. I'm not stuck there, but also I'm not going to pretend that like I know everything that needs to be known. I don't think anyone does. Like, a lot of people, even when they're giving advice on this stuff, I cringe a little sometimes. I'm like, well, that's a very particular point of view, and someone within the same community that you're talking about might disagree with your position on that and say, actually, that isn't the language I want to use or the way I want to be.
Absolutely
right. Yeah.
Until your book, I mean, it'd be great if there was a book, right? like we say, if children came with handbooks, it's the same with this. There is no handbook. So this is why your book is so exciting, is that there's help, that there could be help there that we need.
Yeah, and what I will say is there is lots of books, but there's a couple of things about them. One is I don't think they have an Irish or UK context in mind, and sometimes not even a wider European context. So there's an issue. And then the other thing is that sometimes they're very academic. So, as an average person who doesn't love academia, reading academia, I don't know who does, but some people do, they must, it might not be a book you can consume. And then the third part is there are books about specific, like, individual things, like working within diversity. It's an anti-oppressive book by Myra Chan. And then there's another book, Inclusive Intelligence. And I can't remember the author's name. I'm blanking on her now. But like, there are books, but they talk about very specific things. Whereas I think there's a missing point here, which is inclusion in an organization. You have to use like an organizational, psychological, or development lens. Otherwise, you're missing the reality of that kind of ecosystem that inclusion exists or doesn't exist within.
And it's, as a HR person, you don't have a lot of time to read these things, because there's 70 million things. As a HR person, you're trying to be mom, dad, counselor, strategic advisor, I mean, you're trying to be so many, you're wearing so many hats, right? It's difficult to read up on everything and to be completely informed on the latest thinking. So that's where movements are really important. I love Simon Sinek. He's one of my favorite, management gurus. I remember a long time ago, I was trying to figure out how to change something. And I was like, it's like moving the Titanic, right? How do you move the Titanic? And I read an article from him about creating movements, and it changed the way I looked at everything. So I started looking for the people who were in the movement in that organization, so instead of me trying to fix everything. So, for example, I'm an advocate for fertility, and now becoming an advocate for menopause, because that's where I am, right? But when I created our fertility policy, I wanted it to be an inclusive fertility policy. So again, instead of guessing, I asked one of our ladies who has a child with her wife to look at the policy before I released it and make sure my language was right, that I was thinking of all the things that she would face, not just the things I would face as going in. You know, how do we help everybody with that policy? How do we make sure we're not, you know, accidentally, you know, keeping a segment of our people out? So that's kind of the way I approached it. Again, with that, I suppose, that curiosity and knowing who the people are in the company who are going through those things. They mightn't want to do it publicly. She did not want to advocate publicly, and I completely respected her for it. But because we had a good relationship, she would help me, you know, behind the scenes.
I think that's really important, that piece about, you know, so I do think we have to talk to the right people, but it does come up in the diploma sometimes where people say, well, what about like the tokenism or the kind of exploitation of people with certain lived experiences? And I think in inclusion, what we're trying to do is create invitations, at least in organizations, to say, this is our starting point. What's your input? And who would like to input? And sometimes you might have direct relationships, like you've mentioned, but in kind of large scale efforts, you're often going to have to actually put an open call out for anyone who'd like to influence that conversation. And I think organizations are only just understanding, because of a lot of the pushback and the cancel culture, that those conversations are not about what will make you, this group, happy and what will we give you. It's actually about how would you like to influence this policy, but we still have to make sure that this is legally compliant, you know, within the boundaries of the workplace. And I think that has got a little bit lost with some ERGs, where they then become internal activist groups. And I get why, but the issue is, like, what always happens for me, it isn't like, oh, that's bad for the organization. What happens for me is those people are going to be seen as more part of the employee resource group than their professional identity. And then that becomes something that's kind of weighed against them in some way. And I've seen that happen quite a bit in matured groups, where they get to kind of a standoff with the organization in some way, because actually the boundaries around the work haven't been clear, and the boundaries of influence haven't been clear. You know, you can influence with lived experience as long as you opt in to identify to do so. You opt into the influencing, but that can't be the final point of contact, because at that point then the organization has to think about what is legally compliant, what is our obligation, are we indirectly discriminating, you know, is there unintended consequences? So I do think that we have to bring people together, and I think we have to be clear about the boundaries of that. And I don't just even mean like because sometimes people go, you mean you don't want the employee resource group to take off? I'm like, no, I want it to not, the individuals to not be further exploited or harmed accidentally, because they now feel responsible for advocating internally beyond their professional role. So now they've got a professional role and an internal identity of being an activist, and how that can actually not help the individuals who are advocating. So I totally understand why that colleague would be like, I want it behind the scenes, because she's already carrying an extra burden. Like, she's carrying the burden of, you know, the additional barriers that come with her sexuality. And then she's also, if she was to go public with that, she'd be giving information about herself publicly that she might not want to. And she's already carrying extra, you know, efforts, let's say, or barriers, depending. So I think it's an interesting one that I'm noticing organizations are now dancing with a bit more, where they're saying, actually, we need to work with people with lived experience, but we need to have a process that is fairer around how we do this, and that is careful that we don't like offload the responsibility onto groups.
Totally.
You know, whose job it is.
Yeah. I think what you said there, create an invitation, is a lovely way to put that. You know, it has to be a very genuine invitation, because I also agree as well. And again, I've only got a tiny experience of this with the fertility stuff, but you don't want to become the face of the organization for, well, maybe you do, but most people, like you say, you've got your job to do. You know, you don't necessarily want to be pigeonholed as, so she's the fertility girl, you know.
And do you know what? It's really funny, because that's more likely to happen the more marginalized your identity is. So, like, I literally, we talked about this in the diploma last night, where someone's like, well, with this identity, why am I on every, like, they now have me on every poster, but they, you know, there's not actually that many people with similar identity to me in the organization. So it's actually now a misrepresentation. And now I'm known as the diversity person, not the profession, you know, that I actually have. And I think we have to watch that, you know. Totally engaging people with lived experience is deeply valuable, but also there has to be that kind of an eye on how we're using that engagement, and how we're supporting people to process it. Because one of the things I notice in organizations is when we have these conversations, people are impacted because they already have lived experience and are carrying the weight in some way. But then organizations carry on as if it's a business as usual. And that group might have very strong feelings about something that is or isn't possible. And that might then disturb how they experience their day or whatever. And that isn't always taken into account. Actually, if we're going to access groups that are marginalized, how do we also ensure that there's a well-being on the back end of that being considered? Because they're assuming that it's almost like neutral.
Yes.
You know, and one thing actually, this one I think is interesting is often when I go into organizations, you set these things up or you start these conversations, people don't all come forward. And I've had organizations say, why is that? And I'm like, it's not safe enough yet. We have to create psychological safety that being associated with this group is not going to be a curricular. It is not going to have your manager side-eyeing you. It is not going to give you some kind of label. And then when we do that, you'll see these groups and networks like expand massively. But it's really interesting. There's kind of a naivety that suddenly people with identity that's been marginalized should be like jumping at these groups. And I'm like, well, if you've already like been costed your career in some way or put extra effort in because of this, are you going to be running out of group just because someone says, you know, it is a group for you, especially when you might be suspect of tokenism and HR ticking boxes rather than actually building in an inclusive culture, I guess.
Absolutely. And I think as well, to build on that, you've got the whole, it suddenly becomes a poster campaign in some companies. And that kind of kills me a bit as well, because for me, it's always about being authentic, you know, like I've always celebrated International Women's Day in a big way because I feel so grateful that we live here, you know, in this time. I also want to acknowledge the work we still have to do. I want to make sure that people feel safe there to say whatever, you know, so there's so many reasons I celebrate it. And yes, we take a picture at the end of the day, but it's not about the picture, you know, and that would worry me as well, is that you're using these marginalized groups and they're still processing whatever it is that they're dealing with. So you said about the well-being, you know, so we're trying to get them to come out and be part of the gang and sort of wave the flags, but they're still processing being in this world and being out there in this world. And it's kind of dangerous, I think, for some people who aren't there yet, you know, to be. So it's very vulnerable. That's the word I'm looking for. It's a very vulnerable place to be in when you're not ready.
And I that's so important. And some people don't want those parts of their identity to be the defining part. And there's at the moment, like we've gone from an assimilation culture of, you know, hide anything that's different to a culture of let's celebrate differences. But there's an ignoring that some of that is focusing on one part of someone's identity and not on their whole person. And it's really interesting because, you know, around data, like love collecting data on these things. And I often find that the data isn't even intersectional. So I can't we can't make good decisions on it because you're like this many, this person, this many, that person, but there's no sight of who is in multiple identity groups. And therefore, like the more marginalized groups you're part of, the higher the risk. And, you know, that it's almost like that risk element isn't being assessed, but yet becomes a reality. Because I worked with someone a couple of months ago and they said, you know, it was grand doing that training, but I then had to go and sit next to X, and X basically like said everything that was like harmful about that community. Wow. And I'm sitting there going, I don't have the words, I don't know how to resolve the situation, and X is more senior to me. So we all know we're not meant to be saying these things and we're meant to be saying the other things. But now I'm sitting with someone more senior who's clearly demonstrating to me that that's only an intention, not an expectation. And I think we're missing that a little bit with some of the efforts. There's this kind of over focus on getting it all right to the point where we might not actually be bringing people with us or even linking it to the purpose of the business.
Yeah. Box ticking, essentially.
And some people don't even think they're box ticking. I think that's the part. So there's the people who know they are, and then there's the people who don't know what they're doing is box ticking because that's their remit of understanding around it. I work with a guy, sometimes we do this interesting thing called disrupting diversity, really interesting guy, Simon, and he talks about how there can be, you know, we're not having the real conversations, first of all, which I think is spot on, but also how, you know, you can try to get something so right that you're actually not getting it right at all.
Yeah.
He says it much better than I do. But I think there's a lot of that happening at the moment, where, you know, like that PR stuff, or there's a lot of like efforts, but the nuances behind it aren't being, you know, fully grasped or kind of integrated into how we're going to make this sustainable, how we're going to link it to the business. So he had an example of working with a business, and they wanted to take a position on a particular global political issue currently, and he was like, what's that to do with your business? And they were like, what do you mean? He's like, no, just what's the link? And as we talked about it afterwards, it wasn't just that it wasn't linked. The position they took, this is the fascinating part, when you look through their suppliers, wasn't actually the position they take in reality, like as in where they spend their money and who they work with. So they were going to take this political position externally, while actually there was no political position. It would just be a public statement.
Yeah.
Like, so we need to be careful where we get kind of pulled into societal conversations when organizations actually, you know, may not be behaving that way really when you look at it.
It's like values. So I'm a real values nerd. I'm obsessed with them. I think they're so powerful. But one thing I really believe in is, in a company, you've got your list of values, and people cannot come in and put them on like an overcoat. So it's the same with this kind of thing. You can't just put it on like an overcoat and hope that it fits right. So what I like to do with values is to bring them, to get your values, and then to help you connect your values with the company values and see where the commonalities are. And the problem with values is, and the same with this, is it's lovely to have these statements on the wall, but unless you're living it day in, day out, trying to get it right, trying to figure out how to have the conversations, then you're going to get it more wrong than right. And then people are just going to raise their eyes to heaven when they see the new poster roll out or the new set of values roll out or whatever. So again, it's about the authenticity of it and bringing it more down to the everyday. What happens in the canteen? You know, what happens in the promotion process? You know, how are your policies written? That is much more effective and has much bigger impact on belonging than these big statements that really are quite meaningless.
I really agree. Like, I think statements can be helpful for that external view or a standard putting in place. I do like them for that. But, you know, a lot of people, when they're talking to me about whether their place is inclusive or not, or their leadership is, I'm like, it's a practice, not a conclusion. So, you know, you've got to like temperature check this repeatedly, and not just like once a day. Are you in a room and somebody's being excluded, or you're not including them in their kind of full capacity? But do you know the scientific measure of inclusion? Do you know that it's like half belonging? Okay, so I love this, right? So Short Al 2011 that measure. It's one of the best measures that I have found in all the research. And it is that, just a very simple definition of it is, inclusion requires a balance of belonging with a value and uniqueness, right? If we spend too much time in belonging, we create like groupthink and we create assimilation. If we spend too much time in uniqueness, we create like competitiveness or like individualized views of self and the world, and therefore in work, you know, people aren't working as a team. But for inclusion to occur, I have to feel like I belong, and I have to feel like I can be myself. Otherwise, we're getting like the unintended negative consequences. And I really like that, because I think for a long time, belonging was being used without diversity, because it does happen a lot in very traditional, old-fashioned kind of industries. And people felt like they belonged because they had to assimilate. They wore the right clothes, they spoke the right way, they came from the right schools. And people were like, yeah, I feel like I belong. I'm in the social club, I'm in the golf club. You know, that was happening. When you bring difference in, any like overt differences, and you don't get people to put them away, that doesn't work anymore. You know what I mean? You start indirectly telling people not to be themselves, and in an inappropriate way. Like, there is an appropriate way of, you don't have to bring your whole self to work, because actually some parts of yourself are not appropriate at work. You know, I don't need you to bring your whole self to work, say that, but actually if you're racist, we don't want that part of you. You know, so there's kind of mixed signals. That measure is, we can check, is what's needed belonging, is what's needed appreciating differences, or suddenly for me it's like it's easier to figure out where the balance is, because you can go in and have loads of people getting on, and I'm like, that's a concern for me in terms of the psychology of groups and dynamics. People, we do want people working well together, but if everyone's getting along, they're probably more likely to be in groupthink. and
Yes.
assimilation, rather than in like adult to adult conversations. So I think that's kind of an interesting one when you think about like inclusion, because you've got the belonging piece, but if that goes too far, you might just get assimilation and not actually have the uniqueness kind of valued as well.
I love that. I wrote that down. That is so, I've never heard that.
Heard it of it.
Well, I'll say I heard it from you. No, but and I've experienced that. But like I said to you when we were emailing, that's great that I've experienced it, but I'm white and middle class, and I'm in a country where being female is becoming fine. Yeah, I've never had any issues with being female. Luckily, touch wood, I know lots of people have. So that's great. But again, we go back to the guesswork about what do I need to do as a head of HR so that other people feel that. And that's really interesting. That's really got me thinking about the past places I've worked and, you know.
Yeah. Oh, that's really good. Because I like from a HR perspective, just like even the inclusive leadership perspective. Actually, I spoke to someone about this today where they were saying, you know, when you go to like a senior leadership team meeting and you're trying to get them to engage in diversity and inclusion, like it can sometimes go well, but statistically it's not going down well. And they were saying, you know, just senior leaders who are traditionally, you know, white men in Ireland, whatever, need to listen more. And I was like, actually, I'm going to pull us back. Imagine being told after being highly successful that now the way you do it is wrong. Like that would make no sense to someone that's at their like retirement or at their most senior level. That would make no sense, especially when their job is to produce business outcomes of some sort. So what we need to do is not talk about diversity and inclusion over here like it's a cultural HR job, but start linking it to all the strategic agendas and priorities for the business. And if we're not doing that, how can you expect someone who's responsible for revenue to worry about like something, you know what I mean, that might be deeply important to somebody when they're like, well, actually, I lose my job or maintain my job or I'm successful based on that, not that. And I think we need to start linking them much closer to each other so that senior leaders can actually see how it's relevant to them, which I think is what's missing in a lot of these conversations. There's almost this assumption that they should get it. And when they don't, it's malice. When actually they've lived their lives the way they have, a bit like your point in the beginning. They've lived their lives the way they have. It's worked. They're successful. Yes. If they haven't had the experience of those barriers, they don't even know they exist. No. So even when you tell them, it's not that they're rejecting it, it's that they can't fathom it.
Yes.
So what are we doing to help them link it to why they go to work in the morning? Because just like if I told you about knitting and you're like, but Sheila, we're not knitting. I don't need to knit. Why are you talking about knitting?
Yeah.
That's exactly what happens in some of those trainings because I've been in them kind of horrified. So I think we need to start thinking about how it links to what's important to people.
Yes. And I think as well, I think you touched on something really important there. Actually, a few things. I've got a few things I've written down here. I think you said there that were really, really fascinating. I think as well, when you're more, let's use the word woke, when you get it, right? I think there's a danger that you look at people who don't get it as being bad, at it being very black and white. Bad and good, you know, modern, old-fashioned. And I think you touched on there that it's a lot more complex than that. These aren't necessarily bad people. They just came from a different world and had different experiences and don't understand the barriers. You're absolutely right when you say that. And as soon as they understand, most people go, oh yeah, I get it, or I'm going to try and get it. And it's very few people who will experience, who'll just go blank, no. You know, I'm not buying into that. Absolutely not. I imagine that you've got obviously all the experience with, you know.
No, it's a lot less. Yeah, it's a lot less than what the media. So first of all, media has a big impact on how people perceive this. But there's also a piece in the book, which because I take a psychological lens, which is called splitting. And we do this where we kind of it's kind of a human defense where it's like good and bad, and we are either good or we are bad. And the issue with that in inclusion work is all of us are effectively being inclusive sometimes, and all of us are not other times.
Yeah.
But that's why a lot of people, when you know, people do have reactions to the idea of like their gender being named or race being named, and that's because shame has been used, and shame requires splitting. So I either reject the movement or I reject that I'm doing that. Yeah. And then that also plays out. I reject anyone who does not agree with me on this, which is this kind of polarization that's happening in society. And I think what's happening when I see people doing that, deciding someone's bad because they see the world differently, I'm like, well, how are you including them? Because inclusion in organizations is for everybody. And yes, we need to do extra work for people who've experienced marginalization to ensure that we aren't repeating patterns of oppression, 100%. But that does not mean that you can use oppressive tools against those that you perceive as privileged. And I think that's getting missed sometimes in workplaces. In society, you can do what you want, none of my business. But in workplaces, everybody has the right to be involved and to have to not be discriminated against. Law only covers some categories of discrimination, but we all have a right to be in there and thrive. So that can't be that we attempt to be inclusive by demonizing others. We actually have to look for solutions together. And I think that's becoming more clear now recently. But I do think that we're facing a political kind of seeping into people's understanding. What's your sense of that?
I think as well, you mentioned it earlier, this whole cancel culture isn't helpful when you're trying to re-educate, because, if somebody's being cancelled, then of course they're going to go even further, against whatever it is that they're being cancelled for. And I think that's dangerous. I think it's very black and white as well, as black and white as people accepting or rejecting, differences in the workplace. So, yeah, I think you're completely right. I think it's about solutions. I think it's about understanding. And I think you can only have understanding when you're open. And for me, as a coach, as a HR person, for me, it was always about creating that openness, creating the environment. It's all about creating the environment. And yeah, you're right as well. You can't do it on your own as a HR person, absolutely. But usually we're the ones who kind of,
well, it falls under your umbrella.
And we all get into this job because we love people and we care about people. So it tends to be, come from this area. But I think, you said something earlier on as well. I mean, when I joined my last company, I was the only woman on the exec team. But what we did was exactly what you said. We started talking about it all the time. And so when I left, it was 50-50. But, it was getting to the point where the men were coming to me going, where are the CVs? Get me more CVs so that I've got a more balanced view of, I've got a more balanced panel of people to interview. So again, we weren't doing that whole, tick a box thing, because we were never going to hire somebody if they weren't the right person. But we were trying to create the environment where, firstly, women thrived. And secondly, we were looking to make sure the pool was bigger all the time, so we had more people to choose from. And that was just male, female. I mean, before we even get into all the other, types of diversity. And then another thing you mentioned there that made me think as well about, the complexity of this. I saw something ages ago, and you'll know way more about this than me, about all the different kinds of biases that we have to work against. It was huge. It was a huge sheet. I remember looking at it going, geez, I thought I was good at this stuff. And I'm sure there's loads of these that I'm not watching out for every day. But there was, I mean, you'll know way more how many there is, but there was so many different types of biases that we've got to watch out for in our brain.
It's funny stuff, because I think I'm the worst, I'm the least, I don't know how you'd say it, but I actually have I avoid unconscious bias training with all, I avoid listing it out for people. I avoid, because you can have a list, but the reality is our brain is designed for bias. And so rather than in workplaces trying to change the way people think, because I have ethically, it just doesn't add up for me. If you were trying to change the way I think about inclusion, as in you were trying to say, oh, it's okay to treat people as less than, I would feel that as a crossover. And also the people who want to go to unconscious bias training, that's fine, but there's loads who don't. And then, the evidence is not great. But what I think is really important is that we realize that the reason we want to address unconscious bias isn't because of the unconscious bias, it's because of the impact. And we can do that in workplaces with a lot more ease. We can have processes in place that rectify that stuff, so that you don't have to have individuals outrunning their brains. You know what I mean? You can actually put in processes that there's some accountability for it. You can ensure that communications are addressed in a way that are inclusive and effective. So to me, there's kind of that list is ever growing. And when I meet people and I talk about it, they usually feel overwhelmed. They either have to reject the fact that they're unconsciously biased, or they then feel like really bad people. These are the kind of feelings people have. So just like you said, that long list, I think what we've got to do is learn, not ignore now. If I'm clearly biased in a way that's it keeps showing up, I'm not talking about that, but I'm talking about actually being willing to say that actually in the course of my life, I'm going to learn that I've used a bias ineffectively. And when I do, I'm going to rectify it in some way. And then I will use that learning to prevent it in the future. But I think what we can get caught on is like, here are the 20 whatever. There's actually, like, the list could go on forever. Here's the different biases and they're defined. And then people go around just worried. And that's what I found actually, is people go around worried and fearfully saying the wrong thing and doing the wrong thing. Well, actually not doing the wrong thing, saying the wrong thing. Instead of doing the right thing, which is what I like us to focus on. How do we focus on what the right thing are? How do we focus on learning about the right things? How do we focus on, if we say something, how do we deal with it? We rectify it, So there's something for me about like making it safe enough to actually be in the conversations. Whereas sometimes I think some of that kind of unconscious bias training stuff can actually set people up to double doubt themselves, but not in the helpful, reflective way, but more in a just won't say anything. And that's what I'm hearing a lot in organizations. I either say nothing or I'm fully informed. Most people are in the middle trying to figure out how to just go to work and cope and do well, and they want to be nice people, but they need it to make sense to them.
Authenticity comes back to authenticity again, doesn't it? Because when I read those 30 odd biases, I was like, if I do this, I think I'm already okay at this stuff, like, oh my god, I won't be able to say anything. So you're absolutely right, and your approach to this is so refreshing. It's so refreshing, and so I think engaging for companies who are scared of it.
Yeah. Look, I really appreciate you saying it. My biggest thing is we don't do the best decisions from a place of fear. Like, just the coaching psychology, the fact, like, we do better when we think about what we're aiming for. Rectify the things that aren't right. Like, in terms of discrimination, we should be addressing those. But inclusion is not the opposite to discrimination. It's a completely different process. And we keep using like discrimination, fears, concerns, measurements to decide if something is inclusive. So you could not discriminate and still not include. So I could not treat you differently because you're a woman, but I could still not include you. They're not like mutually exclusive. But we keep looking at it that it's either just like as if discrimination is the definition of inclusion or the foundation, which leads to more of that fear as well, I think, which is, generally people want to do the right thing when they know what the right thing is and it makes sense to them.
Yeah. That's a really good point that you just said there, and I've never thought of it like that they're not opposites. That's a really good point, because I think that's where we all start from. So I'm not going to do this, and this. Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Now, don't get me wrong. If your company is discriminating, or you are, you're not going to do inclusion very well either. But the issue is thinking that inclusion is just dealing with the legal side of discrimination, and like, I could not discriminate, but it doesn't mean you feel like you belong. And also because discrimination is written in legislation, so there's some things not even protected, like class. Like, there's loads of things not protected in discrimination legislation. So you could not be discriminating and still treating a whole group of people and not including them and considering them without technically or legally discriminating. So I think we need some of these conversations, more real ones, being had. So thank you.
No problem. No problem at all.
What would you leave listeners with? Just like, if you're thinking like, because I know that you're kind of working through your niche, you're loving the kind of exploring. It sounds like your work in HR probably really helpful for people in exec roles or career, career kind of processes. Yeah. What would you leave the listeners with today?
So I think one of my favorite things that I evolved into as I got older and got better at my job, maybe. When I was younger, I thought I had to have all the answers, right? And if I didn't have the answers, I'd panic. And as I got older, I realized it was more about facilitating a room full of people who had the answers. And I got really hooked on that. Collaboration gets me so excited. Now, for me, inclusion and collaboration are so connected, because I want a group of people in a room who challenge me, who teach me, who have fresh ideas, have fresh ways of looking at things. So for me, inclusion just makes sense. And for those of us in executive positions, I think we got to get better at being the facilitator in a room of very different people with very different stories and backgrounds and experiences. And then the things that you come out with when you've got a collaborative group working together, it's magic. It's actually magic. I've had so many magical experiences working in groups. And for me, I think that's where I would take, what you're doing to elevate what I've been doing myself, I suppose. I think the connection is just gorgeous. And I think people would really benefit from working on collaboration.
That is one of the 13 effective inclusive leadership practices that I have listed in the book. because you cannot be inclusive without actually including people, but not just people, points of view, thoughts. But what I really love is about that facilitative piece that is so linked to inclusive leadership, like creating spaces and relationships that let people perform. I love that. It's almost like you read the book. It's fantastic. That's excellent. Excellent. Steph, what I'll do is I'll grab some of your details afterwards and put them under these videos so that people can get in contact as well. I really appreciate chatting to you. It's really, really lovely.
Great. I really enjoyed that.
It's a nice little bit of crack on a Thursday. It is Thursday,
and
isn't it?
The launch. How exciting.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. And if you're around, hopefully I'll see you May 18th.
Fingers crossed, I'll have a look at the diary. Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah.
Excellent.
Super.
All right.
Have a great
rest.
Bye. Bye. Bye.